gentlemen, it is such a pleasure for me to welcome, first of all, our speaker Dr. Fran, who is well known in our community, and she's going to be speaking and teaching us what exactly is happening with racism in our country. And you want to learn that. So, speaking about racism, it's probably 2 years ago or 18 months ago, I, while I was watching what's happening in our midst, I went to my dear friend Sue and I told her, Sue, we need to talk about racism. The next day, I went to Sue and I told her, Sue, we need to talk about racism. You know what happened. She searched for a few speakers, and when she couldn't find the first 10, she said, okay, Rebecca, you can talk about racism. And I did. And the following day, we received an email saying, I really don't like the fact that she spoke about racism. Why didn't she speak about how bad our economy is? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're speaking about racism. And if you prefer to speak about inflation, I think it's in another place. So tonight we're going to have a fantastic speaker, and the fantastic speaker is going to be introduced by a fantastic city council member, Annie. And after our speaker, Dr. Franz, speaks, we're going to have questions and answers. And, and the moderator is going to be Marcy. And at the end, this is something new that we're introducing tonight. We're going to have a few minutes of reflection as to what did we learn tonight. And that's going to be done by Willie Phillips. So last thing, I want to thank so very much our volunteers that have been here since 10 o'clock in the morning, putting out the water.
So there is just more amazement to follow. So I have the honor to introduce and tell you just a little bit about this amazing person that's going to give us this information. Dr. Frances Marabou Williams, or Dr. Fran, as she's commonly called by some of her, or by the nickname given to her by her graduate students when she told them, "Don't call me mom." So they, in turn, nicknamed her Dr. Fran. She is recognized as an Orange County community activist who had until now spent her adult life advocating for women and girls in a variety of ways, to include serving 28 years as a college professor and administrator, 30 years as a foster parent, 50 years as a faith leader, 50 years as a faith leader, and equal time as an advocate for social justice, and all the while following what she claims to be her most important role as mother to her two children and wife to her deceased husband. Dr. Fran's professional persona reflects service as a public speaker, television personality, and an advocate for social justice through leadership roles as Orange County's grand jury panelist, Orange County Human Relations Commission, and representing Orange County on the California State Library System. She has been lauded by both the Orange County Register and the Los Angeles Times as one to watch, up close and personal, and one of the most influential members of the community. Her influences closer to home here in Laguna Woods credit her for founding the African American Heritage Club here in the village. Thank you, thank you. Absolutely, a great debt of thank you for that. Leading the Forever 50 Ministry, which is a faith-based organization for seniors, and Junior Miss Christian Leadership Program for young women between ages 9 through 15. Dr. Williams recently relocated to the high desert community of Apple Valley while maintaining relationships and connection with her beloved Orange County, and has already established herself as an advocate for women and girls in that community through her service as head of the Soroptimist International of the Americas, the largest volunteer service organization in America, establishing a chorale group for young girls between the ages of 9 through 14 years, and serving as lead performer with the Apple Valley Chorale Group. Her measure of appropriate and successful accomplishments continues to be feedback from her son, daughter, and now granddaughter and grandson. Her newest project is writing an autobiographical book, Starting at the Finish Line, a self reflection of starting a life anew in terms of location, vocation, relationship, and activities at age 80 and what that really entails. So it is my honor and my privilege to present my friend and my mentor, Dr. Fran Williams.
Good evening, everybody. When I told my daughter I was doing this, she said, "Break a leg, Mom." I now have to report to her, "Don't tell me to do anything like that again." I am delighted to see so many familiar faces. I'm also delighted to be back here in Laguna Woods Village, which I consider my beloved community. I hope you consider it your beloved community as well. I'd like to also thank the community builders for inviting me out here. It's a long journey from Apple Valley to Laguna Woods. And as I was saying to Sue a few minutes ago, it's entirely different and yet very much alike. And the alikeness comes in the form of the people, lovely people in both communities, interesting people in both communities, and welcoming people in both communities. I was very, very proud to know that the members of this community was daring enough and bold enough to have a session on such a controversial subject, one that is often seen as America's elephant in the room. Racism is not an easy subject to talk about, nor is it an easy subject to recognize. Usually, there is negative feedback if that's the first word to a discussion. So, for that, I'd like you to give yourself an applause. Before I do anything else, though, I'd like to dedicate this evening to a dear friend of mine who was my friend for more than 50 years, a Dr. Michael Connor. Michael Connor was my mentor, my co-worker, and he passed away 2 weeks ago. He was also a member of the Laguna Beach community, and he is known as a national advocate for African American fathers. And so, for Mike, I'm doing this. He was the first person that I worked with professionally as a therapist on issues of racism and issues of communities and community development. So let's get this party started. Tonight, um, as we address the biggest elephant in the room, you also chose 3 subtopics: health, housing, and education. They too are biggies. You have no idea how much my head has been spinning of what's the best way to present these 4 topics, each one that would take hours really to explain by itself. And then I was told to put all 3 of them together and do it in 30 minutes and be prepared to answer questions from you. So I'll give it my greatest effort. Whenever I'm making a presentation, my close little family is usually there to critique. Tonight, neither my son nor my daughter is here to critique my presentation. But the family didn't fail me, because there's my granddaughter and my grandson-in-law. I know they'll be ready to critique as soon as I finish. And so here goes. I'd like to give the operational definition of racism, and I want to hear from you if you think that's your idea of what racism is as well. For this program, I want to center on the notion that being different in the context of racism, being different is not a neutral thing. Being different is usually looked upon as a negative kind of thing. When we speak of racism, we also look at inferior and superior in reference to ethnic groups or races of people. Those differences are usually determined in terms of color or physical characteristics. Now, you've got to understand, from an educational perspective and from a psychological perspective, when you speak of a thing, whatever that thing is, you're usually thinking about 4 characteristics. One is color, one is form, the other is size, and the 4th is function. How does it work? So if you're speaking of fabric, you're speaking of a flower, you're speaking of a person, you relate to those 4 characteristics in some way. We're using that as well tonight. When we talk about ism, as in racism, ism refers to your belief, whatever it is you believe in. Okay? So, to say that you believe in something, you believe in colorism, you believe in racism, you believe in fill in the blank, as long as the end of it is ism, you're talking about the belief in how that particular thing operates. Okay? So tonight, when we speak of racism, We're going to look at how you learn, because none of us are born with a belief in anything. We have to be taught that, right? You agree with me? Okay. Okay, so when you're speaking of racism, I'm suggesting to you that you learn about it both consciously and subconsciously. You're not really, you don't really have in mind all the time that what you're learning or what you're doing is supporting the notion that one group is better than the other. But subconsciously, you're collecting data that might support the idea that one group is better than the other. So I'd like to ask you to help me right now to do a demonstration of that. I'm going to read a few statements to you. After each statement, if you believe it applies to you, I'd like you to raise your hand. Okay? Let's give it a try. I am older than Sweet 16. All right, you got it. You got the idea. Here we go. Your first statement. If this applies to you, raise your hand. I was born in a big city. Okay. Most of you were. There's several of you who were not. Statement 2. My childhood neighborhood was ethnically diverse. Not many of you were in ethnically diverse neighborhoods, okay? Number 3. My classroom had students of all the same race. Okay. Okay. You might want to look around as we're going through these statements to see how you and your colleagues are in relation to these statements. Here we go. I often have had ethnically diverse co-workers to my home for dinner. Okay. Most adults in my family are college graduates. All right. Both parents were in my home and worked throughout my childhood. Both parents. Okay. I grew up in a female-headed household. I often did my homework in my neighborhood library. One? Okay. I learned about other ethnic groups from television. All right. I never saw a dentist until I was an adult. Okay. I saw the family doctor every year. Okay. Okay. As you look around, you might have noticed the differences among us here in this room. And I would ask you to think in terms of some of the differences in our communities. From those differences come judgments, understanding, and questions about people whose lives are, and lifestyles are different from your own, right? When that happens, you make judgments about those who are different from you. Those judgments might be different, but they're not given a value unless more is done. And this is what I mean by that. I've worked with young children between the ages of 5 and 7. And there have been times when a white kid look at my arm and rub it. What's wrong with your arm? Thinking that it has to be cleaned. Or because it's brown or black, that there was something wrong with it, only in terms of hygiene. Okay, let me clean your arm. That's an innocent response. No value placed, no blame placed. That same kid, age 12 or 14, can look at that same arm and have a different response. What's happened there? The child has learned that there is a value placed in the differences that he or she observes. And so I'm saying to you, when we're talking about racism, the ism that's taking place is often subconscious, starts relatively early, and is based on the sum total of experiences one has from birth actually to death. What you learn about each other, conclusions that you draw about each other, is based on what you've been exposed to in that period of time. And so, when we talk about racism and its impact on the community, for example, in housing, if you were born and bred in a big city, Your experiences are far different from a child who is born and raised in the country or the suburbs or other kinds of areas. Places of one's birth determines one's experiences, starting with early childhood. And so, is there a library in your neighborhood? If oh. if you are raised in a rural area, for example, chances are you don't have a library nearby to go to do your homework. You might have to travel a bit to get there. If you're raised in a city, depending on another elephant that's in our society, and that would be finances, money, and greed. If you're born in a city and you have chances of being exposed to all of what is supposed to make up that city. We talk about urban planning. We talk about the required institutions in a city for a family and for children to effectively grow up. Most of us grew up before there was such a thing, before we were into urban planning, before we were into the infrastructure and all that's required to be there. Today, if you take any kind of courses in human understanding, you're going to spend some time learning what's supposed to be in a community, in a complete community. Can you think of anything? For a community to be called a community, can you think of anything that has to be there? People, housing, schools, library, health care, hospitals, cemeteries. What did you say over here? Stores, market, transportation, market. All of these things are supposed to be there, right? To make a community a community. But we see communities that are very much void. Many of these things. And those voids and those areas with the voids are usually like that because of lack of what? Money. Finances. Remember I said the other elephant in the room, aside from racism, is finances. And so you start looking at these different communities and people living in these different communities. You might go in one where there's no grocery store for miles. There might be liquor stores, but not grocery stores. No libraries. There might be bars. Usually there are churches, regardless of the level of finances for that community. But you have to search for a hospital, and certainly for specialties and for clinics. You start seeing the divide. And with that divide are attitudes about groups. If their lifestyle is different and they're not the dominant group, an attitude that's common is, they don't really need that. Have you ever wondered about that? Have you ever associated that with racism? Who determines which community has what? You look to your land developers? Do you look to the fathers and leaders in that community? Have you ever wondered about how it came to be that one community had schools sufficient for the children and other communities are still begging for a facility that's appropriate as a school and for their children? These are some of the things that I think manifest themselves subconsciously. And when you talk about racism and you talk about people who are promoting on a constant racism, these people are not really that conscious and that concerned about members of a given community. And so there's not much that they do to correct the situation. I don't know how many of you know that consciously we're situated in such a way that we're really divided and encouraged to be divided in our living space and with our lifestyle. I'm not so sure how many of us are aware of our city's books and what it says about housing. I'm sure many of you in here are aware of the practice of blue lining. Are you not? Here in Orange County, it's known for it, really. Famous for it. And where it's on the books in all 34 cities, trust me, I know this to be true because it's one of the things that we examined as grand jurors. One of the things was looking at how communities are divided, what's given the okay in some communities and not given the okay to others. What cities require that there be X number of trees lining the streets? You ever have time to visit the Hall of Records and check the records, you'll see the blue lining and what it means and how realtors are steered away from certain neighborhoods based on the ethnicity of the people buying the houses. And if you don't want to go to the Hall of Records, you can always ask at your banks. Because then there are your banks that have requirements on who they'll give a bank loan to buy a house and who they will not. Right now, Bank of America has a brand new initiative developed in this year, 2023. With that initiative, it's an initiative to give loans to African Americans to buy homes. But the homes have to be in a designated area. You can't just get a loan to buy a house wherever you choose to live. You have to keep it in that designated area. To me, this is institutional racism at its best. To me, this is not a subconscious act in doing so. Another, as we look at housing, another issue is here in Laguna Woods, wonderful place to live. There is nothing you can say that you want that isn't here, or that you need that isn't here. It might be something you want that isn't here, but there's nothing that you would need for your community that isn't here. One of those things are the stores. You have everybody, right? Aldi's, Stater Brothers, Trader Joe's. But guess what? Trader Joe will not place itself in a community unless the income level for more than 50% of its residents is what they feel it should be. So you have to reach a standard of income as well as a level of education in order to have a Trader Joe's. Did you know that? Okay. To me, that's another part of racism. And so I saw in the note to me the question, what can we do as a people, or what can we do as an individual? There's so many things that we can address and so many things that we can do. One of them is being aware of what the rulings are for the place where we live. And finding out those rulings comes from looking at what constitutes a community. And then, what have we done to have these things that make up a community in our area? Okay? I'm doing that because there's an equal number of concerns and of issues when it comes to health care, when it comes to hospitals, when it comes to services in our communities. And at the same time, I'm being shown that my time is up. So I want you to know, though, that for each of the three things that you've asked me to talk about, education is the main tool. Being knowledgeable about these things is where I look to education for this. And I see where we're working with the institutional racism as it relates to education. The biggest thing that has happened recently is eliminating affirmative action, uh, not agreeing to student to reducing student loans or forgiveness for student loans. I look at knowing, I think Annie mentioned in her introduction of me, uh, when I was of school age and going to college, California was the mecca because education was what? Free. Okay. And we're just now beginning to get back to that to some extent, but we're getting back to that with hundreds, if not thousands, of students who are now saddled with enormous student loans, enormous payment of student loans. Anyway, education is the tool that you need because with education comes knowledge about your community. And as I said, housing being one of the primary areas, healthcare being yet another, and each of them being a subject all of its own, but they all go right back to education. So I'm going to stop before they yank me off the stage with one of those pull-off sticks.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know of any grade school program that is fighting prejudice?
No. I do know, though, seriously, I do know of schools where um, they're looking at bringing students together from different ethnic groups.
Don't think that the DEI programs that are now very popular in HR are effective, and if changed.
Do I think that
The,
they're
the, uh,
effective?
yes, the DEI versus which are popular in HR nowadays.
To an extent. To an extent, they're effective. Yes. But I don't think that we have enough to really make a significant impact.
Thank you for your nice talk. I think your singling out Trader Joe's covers over a much deeper problem. It has to do with demographics. I can't imagine any large corporation concerned about profit and their various affiliates wouldn't consider the demographics. That's not necessarily directly racist, but it certainly does promote racism by following that profit motive. And I think that's a very deep issue. And you just touched on it lightly, don't you think?
I agree with you. I couldn't give multiple examples. And I did Trader Joe mainly because, well, for a couple of reasons. And they're pretty much personal. As was mentioned in my introduction, I've moved from here to the high desert area. The ethnic um, distribution in the high desert is pretty much the same as here in terms of African Americans in Apple Valley. We have less than 2% African Americans in Apple Valley. In the surrounding areas, Hesperia and Victorville, they have a larger percent. I know that in Victorville, it's 13% African Americans. I also know that all of the communities, and there are 5 that identify themselves as high desert, are making an effort right now as we speak to get a Trader Joe's in the area. So I'm very much familiar with the what and the why of Trader Joe's. And that's not to say that it's exclusive or the only store that has this policy or this problem. But it is the one that I'm currently working with to affect a change. I want to say something else too. My deal was, and I have a program, an agency actually, Marabou Creative Concepts in Education is what we call it. And one of the things that we do is have dinner and conversation about hard topics, racism being one of the hard topics, with the idea that if we talk about, if we dialogue issues that impact our community, wherever that community happens to be, we can do it in a non-hostile fashion. And if we do it in that non-hostile fashion, people are more likely to listen and to hear what's being said. There's no denying the racism in this country. But to talk about it does not require fighting, shooting, or any other kind of violence to do so. And with Marabou Creative Concepts, one of the things that we do is much of what's happening right here tonight. And that is discussing those things and trying to discuss those things as civilly as possible for all of us.
Hi, thank you very much for coming today. And I'm interested in racism partly because both sides of my ancestors, my mother's family, my father's family, were enslavers, which I found out through genealogy records, but I had no idea. No one talked about it. Many slaves, every generation going back a long time. I wanted to ask about an article recently in the Los Angeles Times that talked about maybe up until the 1960s, Black students were not allowed to rent near UCLA in Westwood, and earlier they weren't allowed unless they were registered as domestic servants. So I think what a handicap to not have been able to live near UCLA as late as the 60s is my understanding. So how did that change? Was there activism at UCLA that began to allow students simply to rent lodging around UCLA? Thank you.
And my response is, I came here on a scholarship to UCLA. It was in the 60s. I think it's a part of the aftermath of the movement, the civil rights movement, that happened during the 60s. And it was more a matter of money than a matter of excluding African Americans. I think also it was a part of the blue lining that I mentioned earlier, where cities or towns had had it as a violation or a way of keeping African American students out of communities, African American people themselves, students and no, out of certain communities. And it was done more on the basis of not accepting things like your credit score, saying that they didn't qualify. With a change in that, also came a change in allowing students to live in the area. So you had both of those things going at that time.
My question is this. I agree with you that education's important and that getting together in a or in a civil way and talking about things is great. But there's a growing movement in many places to say we can't even talk about racism. We ban the books. We don't want to make people feel bad. So with all that going on, how do we fight that? I mean, it's very local, but it's more and more happening in different places in the country, even in California here now. It seems like we're fighting an uphill battle against that to try to just get together and talk when we're banning talking about it.
And the tool that we have is the vote. Remember, whoever you put there, whoever you identify as your leader, is the person who is saying, ban this or ban that. They are the ones who have the power and the prestige. But we're the ones to give them that power or prestige. And if we don't bother to use what we have in those terms, we end up with getting what we may or may not like. The vote is still pretty powerful. My argument in that regard, when you're looking at races, we say in our Constitution, we say all men are created equal, one man, one vote. However, if you have to, these same people who are saying that, say something like, we have to have a Voting Right Act for people of color, especially for black people, to vote. How is that? So, what I look to is, how do we infiltrate, how do we make a dent in the power brokers and how they're coming up with these laws?
Dr. Fran, my question, I want a very specific answer as to how to. You said that everybody nowadays knows there is racism. What do you say to a person when they tell you, what are you talking about? There is no racism in this country.
Because no one wants to own their legacy. And unfortunately, racism is a legacy among people who were the dominant society. And it's carried on by the rule makers of the day. So again, I would see looking at who's in charge. Who's in charge and how do they get there? And if you don't want them there, what do you do to get rid of them?
That person telling you there's no racism. How would you personally respond to that person that told you there is no such thing as racism in this country?
Personally, I would look for an example that I think they would relate to in terms of racism and say this is what my definition of racism is. If, like I gave earlier, speaking of the child responding to the color of my skin, okay, that's not racism. The older child responding in a judgmental way to the color of my skin is racism. So I would look to give an example that the person I'm speaking to might be able to relate to.
Hi, Fran. I too was at UCLA in the late 60s, and I really think the problem there was it was just economically not feasible to live in that community. I did have some friends who lived in Westwood if they could afford it, and they were workers. They were people that worked there. But that's one of the big problems, is the finances, like you said. And it is a systemic method of keeping certain people out. This whole issue on affirmative action, in my opinion, is because a little progress has been made, because someone like Dr. Fran can be outspoken, there is a literal backlash to shut these people up. And also that they don't want, when they say they don't want their children to be ashamed, I wonder about my children, because they were shamed for years and years. So it's really a very tough situation for us right now. And you're right, we've got to get out and fight.